The archives of the lycanthrope world hold many classified secrets, but none as fiercely debated as the Kensington incident of 2019. For years, the history books said she was defective, a broken, useless thing. Maeve Kensington hadn't spoken a single word in a decade, relegated to the life of a lowly Omega, scrubbing the hardwood floors of her pack house while the elite paraded their bloodlines. But the night the Alpha King finally descended upon their territory, the entire hierarchy of their ancient society shattered. No one expected the ruthless, untouchable sovereign to drop to his knees in the dirt, and they certainly didn't expect the silent, battered girl to be the one commanding his submission. This is the unredacted truth they tried to erase. To understand the magnitude of the tremor that would soon rock the werewolf foundations, one must first understand the absolute insignificance of Maeve Kensington. Nestled deep within the mist-shrouded valleys of the Pacific Northwest, the Silver Pine Pack was renowned for its brutal adherence to tradition. They were a wealthy, militaristic pack, heavily involved in human corporate real estate to mask their vast territories. In this world, power was currency, and weakness was a sin punishable by severe isolation. Maeve was born into a respected Delta family, but tragedy had stripped her of her status by her 8th birthday. A rogue attack had decimated her childhood home, leaving her orphaned and inexplicably mute. The trauma was blamed for her silence, but the pack healers whispered of something else, a blockage in her spiritual channels, a defect that rendered her wolf completely dormant. By her 18th birthday, Maeve had been officially demoted to the rank of Omega. She was the ghost that haunted the grand, sprawling manor of the Silver Pine elite. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and biting with the promise of early snow, when the cruelty of her reality was on full display. Maeve knelt on the Italian marble of the grand foyer, her raw, red hands plunging into a bucket of icy water. The manor had to be spotless. The Alpha King was coming. You missed a spot. Mute. The sharp, mocking voice belonged to Adele Harrison, the Alpha's youngest daughter. Adele was the epitome of Silver Pine perfection. Tall, impossibly blonde, and radiating the sharp, oppressive scent of blooming jasmine and dominance. She deliberately dragged the muddy heel of her designer riding boot across the freshly polished stone. Maeve didn't flinch. She simply wrung out her sponge, the icy water biting at her knuckles, and moved to clean the fresh stain. Showing reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. In the silence of her own mind, however, a strange, low hum vibrated a frequency she had spent 10 years pushing down. Every time she was humiliated, every time a physical blow landed, the hum grew louder, like a caged beast rattling iron bars in the darkest corner of her soul. I don't even know why my father lets you stay in the main house during the king's visit, Adele continued, leaning against the mahogany banister. She exchanged a cruel smirk with her companion, Liam Mercer, the future beta of the pack. Alistair Sterling doesn't tolerate filth. If he sees an Omega like you, completely devoid of a wolf, he might just execute you on principle to clean up the gene pool. Liam chuckled, a low rumbling sound. Just keep her locked in the kitchens. If King Alistair catches a whiff of her, what does she even smell like? Rainwater and dust? It's pathetic. Maeve kept her head bowed, her dark hair falling like a curtain over her pale face. She focused on the rhythm of the sponge. Scrub, rinse, repeat. She didn't care about King Alistair Sterling. She only cared about survival. The king was a legend of brutality, a man who had united the fractured North American territories through sheer, terrifying force. He was a tyrant wrapped in expensive tailored suits, ruling from his penthouse in Seattle. To Maeve, he was just another alpha, another source of pain to avoid. As Adele and Liam finally grew bored and wandered off to the dining hall, Maeve sat back on her heels, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. She looked at her trembling hands. The hum in her chest was agitated today. The approaching arrival of the royal pack was sending ripples of anxiety through the Silver Pine territory, and Maeve's dormant instincts were absorbing every ounce of that ambient panic. She pressed a hand to her sternum, closing her eyes. Quiet, she commanded her soul. Stay hidden, stay safe. She knew what the healers didn't. Her wolf wasn't dead. It wasn't missing. It was simply too terrifying to let out. The arrival of King Alistair Sterling was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't arrive with a massive, roaring motorcade, nor did he demand a parade. Instead, 3 sleek black SUVs rolled silently up the gravel driveway of the Silver Pine Manor just as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. The entire pack hierarchy, numbering over 200 wolves, stood at rigid attention on the front lawn. Alpha Harrison, Adele's father, stood at the very front, sweating profusely despite the freezing temperature. Maeve was positioned exactly where she was ordered to be, out of sight. She was relegated to the servants' corridor, peeking through the crack of the heavy oak doors that led to the main hall. She had been tasked with holding a tray of crystal champagne flutes, ready to serve the king's guard if summoned. When the door of the lead SUV opened, the air pressure in the estate plummeted. It was a physical weight, a suffocating aura of pure, unadulterated dominance that slammed into every wolf present. Several lower-ranking members instantly dropped to their knees, unable to withstand the pressure. Alistair Sterling stepped out. He was devastatingly handsome, but in a way that screamed danger rather than comfort. Tall, broad-shouldered, with raven black hair and eyes the color of a stormy ocean. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the earth beneath his feet. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, entirely out of place in the rustic mountain setting, yet he made the environment look inadequate. Alpha Harrison. Alistair's voice was a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It carried no warmth. My king, Harrison bowed deeply, exposing his neck. Silver Pine is honored by your presence. Maeve watched through the crack, her breath catching. It wasn't the man's power that startled her, it was the sudden, violent reaction inside her own body. The moment Alistair spoke, the caged hum in Maeve's chest erupted into a deafening roar. A scent hit her, cutting through the heavy musk of 200 anxious wolves. It smelled of ozone just before a lightning strike, burning ash, and deep, dark earth. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. Mate. The word echoed in her mind. Not a thought, but a primal scream from the entity she had kept locked away. Maeve stumbled backward, her hands shaking violently. No, 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 no. An Omega and a king? A mute, broken girl, and the most powerful alpha on the continent? The moon goddess was playing a sick, twisted joke. Panic seized her. She turned to flee down the corridor, but her foot caught on the edge of a poorly laid rug. She went down hard. The silver tray slipped from her grasp. The crash of 24 crystal flutes shattering against the stone floor echoed like gunfire through the silent, tense manor. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Outside in the hall, Alistair Sterling stopped mid-stride. His head snapped toward the heavy oak doors of the servants' corridor. His nostrils flared. Alpha Harrison turned pale. A clumsy servant, my king. Please, forgive the intrusion. The grand dining room is this way. But Alistair wasn't listening. His stormy eyes were locked onto the wooden doors. The suffocating aura of dominance that he naturally projected suddenly spiked, laced with something wild and frantic. Without a word to the trembling alpha of Silver Pine, Alistair strode toward the corridor. Your Majesty. Adele Harrison stepped forward, attempting to intercept him with a dazzling, desperate smile. Let the staff handle the mess. I would love to show you the gardens. Alistair didn't even look at her. He simply emitted a low, guttural growl that forced Adele to take a stumbling step back, her hands flying to her throat. He pushed the heavy oak doors open. Maeve was on her knees, frantically trying to gather the shards of broken glass with bleeding fingers. She froze as the shadow of the Alpha King fell over her. The scent of thunder and ash was overwhelmingly thick now, making her lightheaded. She kept her head down, waiting for the killing blow. Omegas were executed for lesser insults to visiting royalty. She saw his expensive leather shoes step into the puddle of spilled champagne. Then, the impossible happened. The king did not strike her. He did not yell. Slowly, gracefully, Alistair Sterling knelt amidst the broken glass. The guard standing in the doorway gasped. Alpha Harrison, who had hurried behind his king, looked as though he might faint. Alistair reached out. His large, calloused hand gently grasped Maeve's wrist, stopping her from picking up another sharp shard. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, a fiery warmth that immediately healed the small cuts on her fingers. Look at me, he commanded. The voice was soft, meant only for her, but it carried the absolute authority of a soulbind. Maeve couldn't resist the command. Slowly, she lifted her chin. Her large, terrified hazel eyes met his stormy blue ones. Alistair's breath hitched. For a fleeting second, the terrifying Alpha King looked completely, utterly unmoored. The recognition in his eyes was undeniable. He felt it too. But as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, the mask of the ruthless king slammed back into place. He realized where they were. He realized the hundreds of eyes watching him kneel before a filthy mute Omega. He knew the political assassination this would cause if he claimed her right now in front of a pack of vipers. He stood up abruptly, dropping her wrist as if it burned him. Have this cleaned, Alistair snapped coldly, not looking at Maeve again as he turned on his heel. And ensure your staff is properly trained, Harrison. I despise incompetence. He walked away, leaving Maeve kneeling in the glass, her heart shattered long before the crystal had ever hit the floor. Word of the incident in the corridor spread through the Silver Pine pack like wildfire. The official story, pushed heavily by Alpha Harrison and Adele, was that the king was merely inspecting the damage and scolding the Omega. But wolves communicate in subtleties, in shifts of scent, in dilated pupils, in the tension of a jawline. The pack had smelled the sudden spike in the king's pheromones. They had seen him touch her. For the next 3 days, Maeve's life became a living hell. Alistair played his part perfectly. He attended the endless string of meetings, negotiating territory, borders, and trade agreements with Harrison. He never once asked for Maeve. He never looked for her. To the untrained eye, he had forgotten the clumsy servant entirely. But Maeve knew better. She felt him. The mate bond, even unconsummated and rejected, was a tether. She could feel his suppressed rage whenever Adele Harrison fawned over him at dinner. She could feel his insomnia late at night, a restless, pacing energy that kept her staring at the ceiling of her cramped basement room. And worst of all, she could feel his eyes on her whenever she was forced to serve in the periphery of his vision. Adele Harrison, however, was neither blind nor stupid. The Alpha's daughter recognized the subtle shift in the air whenever the mute Omega was in the room. Her jealousy quickly metastasized into a violent, paranoid hatred. She was supposed to be the one to catch the king's eye. Her father had practically offered her to him on a silver platter to secure an alliance. On the 4th afternoon of the king's visit, a torrential downpour trapped the pack indoors. The elite gathered in the sprawling solarium for afternoon tea and high-stakes poker. Maeve was tasked with keeping the massive stone fireplace stoked. She was kneeling by the hearth, her back to the room, feeding thick cedar logs into the roaring flames. The heat was blistering, but it was nothing compared to the burning gaze she felt boring into her spine from across the room, where Alistair sat holding a tumbler of whiskey. "Hey, mute," Maeve tensed. Adele had broken away from the poker table and was standing right behind her, a porcelain teacup in her hand. The scent of jasmine was entirely soured by malice and aggression. "I told you yesterday to starch my evening gown. You didn't do it." Adele's voice was deceptively calm, but her aura was lashing out, a heavy, oppressive weight meant to force an Omega to submit. Maeve kept her eyes on the fire. She had starched the gown. She had spent 2 hours on it, but she knew arguing, even if she could speak, was useless. She bowed her head, the universal sign of lycanthrope apology. "A bow doesn't fix my dress, you worthless piece of trash," Adele hissed, stepping closer. "You think because the king pitied you for 5 seconds that you're suddenly exempt from your duties? You think he actually looked at you?" Across the room, the low murmur of conversation began to die down. The tension in the solarium spiked. Maeve could feel Alistair's energy shifting, the stormy scent of ozone growing sharp and metallic. He was watching. The whole room was watching. "You're an abomination," Adele sneered, leaning down so her lips were inches from Maeve's ear. "You have no wolf. You have no voice. You are nothing. After the king leaves, my father is going to exile you to the rogue lands. You won't last a night." The threat of exile was a death sentence. The caged beast inside Maeve, the entity she had starved and suppressed for a decade, violently slammed against its mental restraints. "No, look at me when I'm speaking to you," Adele suddenly shrieked, her control snapping. In a flash of movement, she hurled the boiling hot tea directly at Maeve's face. Maeve threw her arms up. The scalding liquid splashed across her forearms, burning her skin. A silent gasp tore from her throat, but the physical pain was secondary to the mental dam that had just catastrophically failed. The 10 years of abuse, the crushing loneliness, the agony of finding her mate only to be ignored, and now the threat of death. It was too much. The lock broke. Maeve didn't scream, but the air around her did. A shockwave of sheer concussive force exploded from Maeve's kneeling form. It wasn't physical, it was spiritual. It was an aura so ancient, so overwhelmingly dominant, that it defied the laws of their kind. The heavy stone logs in the fireplace shattered. The reinforced glass of the solarium windows webbed with millions of cracks. Adele Harrison, a pure-blooded Alpha's daughter, was blasted backward as if hit by a freight train, crashing violently into a velvet sofa. Throughout the room, high-ranking betas and seasoned warriors collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching their throats as their inner wolves were violently forced into submission. The pressure was unimaginable. It was the aura of a true ancient, a bloodline thought to have died out centuries ago, the aura of an alpha of alphas. In the center of the room, still kneeling but radiating a terrifying, pulsating silver light, was the silent Omega. Maeve's hazel eyes had bled into a blinding, luminescent gold. Only one person remained standing. Alistair Sterling stood up from his leather armchair. His whiskey glass had shattered in his grip, blood dripping down his knuckles. but he didn't seem to notice. His chest heaved as he fought against the crushing gravity of her power. He didn't look angry. He looked awestruck. He looked like a man who had just found a god hiding in the dirt. Maeve slowly turned her head, her glowing golden eyes locking onto Alistair. The silent message in her gaze was clear, reverberating through the minds of everyone in the room. The silence that followed Maeve's catastrophic release of power was not empty. It was pressurized, ringing with the phantom echo of a shattered hierarchy. The solarium, once a testament to Silverpine's exorbitant wealth, looked like the epicenter of a bomb blast. Designer furniture lay splintered. The ancient stone hearth was nothing but smoking rubble, and scattered across the floor, the elite warriors of the pack were gasping, their inner wolves pinned to the spiritual floor by an invisible, crushing weight. Adele Harrison, the golden child of the pack, was hyperventilating against the far wall, her designer gown ruined, her perfect face contorted in absolute terror. She tried to scramble backward, her manicured fingers scraping against the ruined oak floorboards, but the oppressive aura radiating from the kneeling girl locked her limbs in place. Maeve remained perfectly still amidst the destruction. Her chest heaved, her knuckles white where they gripped the hem of her damp, stained uniform. The golden light in her eyes was wild, untamed, a beacon of a bloodline that the modern world had forgotten. For a decade, she had believed she was broken. Now, the realization crashed over her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't devoid of a wolf. Her wolf was simply too massive, too ancient, to be contained by a child's fragile mind. It had slept to protect her. Now, provoked by the threat of death, it had awakened to conquer. Through the haze of her newly unleashed instincts, a scent pierced the metallic ozone of her own aura. Thunder and ash. Alistair Sterling, the Alpha King, was the only entity in the room refusing to stay down. Blood dripped steadily from his lacerated hand where the whiskey glass had shattered, pooling on the polished floor. But his focus was absolute. Every muscle in his broad chest and shoulders was coiled with tension as he fought against the gravitational pull of Maeve's dominance. To a normal wolf, resisting an ancient's aura was fatal. It would rupture their spiritual core. But Alistair was no ordinary alpha. With agonizing slowness, Alistair took a step forward. His heavy leather shoe crunched on broken glass. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Alpha Harrison, trembling violently on his hands and knees nearby, choked out a warning. "My king, stay back. She's gone rogue. She's a monster. Guards, take her down!" The 4 heavily armed royal guards stationed at the doors. Elite killers who had survived wars couldn't even lift their heads from the floor, let alone draw their weapons. Alistair didn't spare the Silverpine Alpha a single glance. He kept his stormy blue eyes locked entirely on Maeve's glowing gold ones. He took another step. The air around him shimmered as his own formidable aura. The power that had united a continent clashed fiercely against hers. It was a battle of unseen titans, causing the remaining intact glass in the room to groan in protest. Maeve felt a spike of panic. "He's coming to kill me," her human mind whispered. "I embarrassed him. I exposed myself." Her golden eyes flared, and the pressure in the room doubled. A beta near the doorway whimpered as his nose began to bleed. "Easy." Alistair's voice was a low, vibrating rumble that bypassed Maeve's ears and resonated directly in her chest. "Easy, little wolf. I am not your enemy." He stopped 2 feet in front of her. The tension between them was a physical current, sparking and snapping. Maeve looked up at him, her breathing ragged. She was a servant, a mute omega, kneeling in the ashes of a destroyed fireplace. He was a billionaire king wrapped in bespoke tailoring. Yet, in the spiritual realm that governed their kind, the scales had violently tipped. Slowly, deliberately, Alistair Sterling, the ruthless tyrant of the North American territories, lowered his head. He didn't just break eye contact. He exposed the vulnerable line of his throat to her. Then, the impossible happened. The king dropped to his knees in the dust and the ruin, placing himself on her level. "I have searched for you," Alistair whispered, the words ragged, entirely stripped of their usual cold command. He reached out, ignoring her flinch, and gently cupped her soot-stained cheek. The contact was electric. The oppressive, crushing weight in the room instantly vanished, sucked back into Maeve's skin the moment her mate touched her. "My queen." The collective gasp from the conscious wolves in the room was a symphony of shock. Alpha Harrison looked as though he had been physically struck. Adele began to sob openly, the reality of her ruined ambitions crashing down upon her. Alistair stood, and without a word, he gathered the trembling Maeve into his arms. He lifted her effortlessly against his chest, shielding her battered form with his dark suit jacket. "Harrison, Alistair's voice returned to its chilling, authoritative baseline, echoing off the ruined walls. He turned his head to look at the cowering Alpha. If a single hair on her head is harmed, if you or your pathetic excuse for a daughter ever speak her name again, I will return to Silver Pine and burn it to the bedrock. You will hear from my council. With that, the Alpha King carried the silent Omega out of the manor, leaving the Silver Pine elite to choke on the dust of their shattered reality. The Sterling estate in Seattle was a fortress of glass and steel, towering above the human city, heavily fortified by the Royal Guard. For Maeve, it felt less like a prison, and more like an isolation chamber for a bomb about to detonate. For the first 48 hours, she slept, her body, severely malnourished and completely exhausted by the unprecedented release of spiritual energy, shut down. When she finally opened her eyes, she was enveloped in high thread count silk sheets, the scent of thunder and ash wrapped securely around her senses. She wasn't alone. Alistair sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the sprawling master bedroom, surrounded by stacks of ancient leather-bound ledgers. He hadn't slept. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, but the moment she stirred, he was at her side. "You're safe," he murmured, handing her a glass of ice water. He didn't push her to speak. He seemed perfectly content with the silence, communicating his reassurances through the steady, calming warmth of the mate bond that pulsed between them. Over the next week, the true gravity of Maeve's existence began to unravel, not through magic, but through meticulous, undeniable paper trails. Alistair had summoned Dr. Silas Montgomery, the chief royal historian and the most feared forensic accountant in the lycanthrope world. Silas was a meticulously dressed older wolf with a sharp gaze and an encyclopedic knowledge of pack lineages. He spent days buried in the archives, cross-referencing Maeve's birth records with private financial sectors. On a rainy Thursday, Silas requested an audience with Alistair and Maeve in the penthouse study. Maeve sat tentatively on the edge of a velvet sofa, dressed in soft cashmere, while Alistair stood protectively behind her. "Your Majesty," Silas began, pushing his gold-rimmed glasses up his nose. He looked at Maeve with a mixture of profound respect and deep sorrow. The girl is not a Delta, and she is certainly not an Omega. Alistair's jaw tightened. "Explain." Silas opened a thick, red leather folder. "I dug into the private records of Arthur Kensington, Maeve's late father. The Silver Pine Pack always claimed Arthur was merely a mid-level manager in their human real estate fronts. Lie. A massive, foundational lie." Silas slid a series of laminated human banking records and property deeds across the glass table. Arthur Kensington was the sole inheritor of the Aethelgard lineage. It's an ancient bloodline, thought to be extinct, known for producing wolves with an alpha of alphas aura wolves, whose sheer spiritual gravity could enforce peace without shedding a drop of blood. Maeve stared at the documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached out, tracing her father's elegant signature on a document dated 12 years ago. "But it's more than just spiritual power, sire," Silas continued, his voice hardening. "Arthur Kensington was the silent majority shareholder of the Vanguard Trust. Vanguard is the human shell corporation that technically owns the deed to the entire 300,000 acres of the Silver Pine territory. Alpha Harrison doesn't own his land. The Kensington family does." The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the implication of the historian's words. Alistair's eyes darkened to the color of a midnight storm. "Harrison orchestrated the rogue attack. It is the only logical conclusion." Silas nodded grimly. Arthur Kensington was preparing to audit the pack's finances. Harrison was embezzling millions to fund his own lavish lifestyle and secure political bribes. If Arthur had completed the audit, Harrison would have been ruined. So, he hired mercenaries to wipe out the family. They killed Arthur and his wife, but the daughter, Maeve, survived. Alistair looked down at Maeve. Her hazel eyes were wide, brimming with unshed tears. The trauma that had stolen her voice, the decade of abuse, the scrubbing of floors in the house built on her stolen wealth. It was all a calculated, brutal cover-up. Harrison hadn't demoted her out of disgust for her weakness. He had kept her close, starved her, and broke her spirit to ensure she never remembered who she was, and more importantly, what she owned. "The Vanguard Trust is locked in a blood-warded escrow," Silas concluded. "It requires the biological signature of a living Kensington to access. Harrison has been trying to hack it legally for 10 years but failed. You are not a penniless Omega, Maeve. You are a multi-billionaire, the true owner of Silver Pine, and the last living ancient." Alistair's aura flared with a murderous, terrifying rage. The glass windows of the penthouse rattled violently. He turned toward the door. "Summon the guard. We are going to war." But before he could take a step, a soft, pale hand caught his wrist. Alistair looked back. Maeve was standing. Her golden eyes were glowing softly, not with wild, uncontrolled power, but with cold, calculated purpose. She shook her head. She didn't want a bloodbath. She didn't want the king to slaughter her abusers in a blind rage. That was too easy. She reached for a silver pen on Alistair's desk and pulled a piece of expensive stationery toward her. With steady hands, she wrote a single sentence and held it up for him to read. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Alistair's face. It was the smile of a ruthless king looking at his perfect equal. As you wish, my queen. We will take everything. 3 weeks later, the annual North American Lichen Summit was held. It was the premier social and political event of the year, a high-stakes gathering where alliances were forged and enemies were subtly crushed under the guise of civility. This year, the summit was hosted by none other than Alpha Harrison, held at the opulent Grand Obsidian Hotel in downtown Portland, a neutral ground for all packs. Harrison had spared no expense. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, champagne flowed like water, and the ballroom was packed with the most influential wolves on the continent. Harrison was practically glowing with smug satisfaction. In the weeks since the king's abrupt departure, he had spun a masterful web of lies. He spread rumors that the king had left in disgust over a rogue Omega's violent outburst, assuring his allies that the Silver Pine Pack was stable. Tonight, he planned to announce the engagement of his daughter, Adele, to Liam Mercer, officially solidifying his political dynasty. At exactly 9 p.m., Harrison stepped up to the crystal podium at the front of the ballroom, tapping a spoon against his glass. The room fell silent. Esteemed alphas, betas, and honored guests, Harrison began, his voice booming with forced joviality. We gather tonight to celebrate unity, strength, and the enduring prosperity of our kind. I also stand before you to announce the joining of two powerful— He never finished the sentence. The massive, 12-foot mahogany doors of the ballroom did not simply open. They were violently thrown wide, the heavy wood slamming against the marble walls with a sound like a cannon shot. The entire ballroom froze. Standing in the entryway, flanked by 12 royal guards in full tactical dress, was Alistair Sterling. He wore a tuxedo black as the void, his presence instantly suffocating the room with a dominant gravity that forced several lower-ranking wolves to their knees. But it wasn't the king who drew the gasps of absolute shock. It was the woman on his arm. Maeve Kensington stepped into the light. She was unrecognizable. The bruised, silent, filthy Omega was dead. In her place stood a queen carved from ice and fire. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves, her dark hair swept up in an elegant, intricate style. But her most striking feature was the colossal, flawless sapphire resting against her collarbone, the Aethelgard ancestral jewel, a stone last seen in the public eye a century ago. Her hazel eyes, lined with sharp, dark makeup, swept across the crowd, radiating a calm, terrifying confidence. Adele Harrison, standing near the podium, dropped her champagne glass. It shattered, mirroring the sound from the corridor weeks ago. But this time, Maeve didn't flinch. King Alistair. Harrison choked out, his face draining of all color as he gripped the podium. We did not expect you. And, who is this? He tried to play dumb, hoping against hope the disguise would hold. Alistair smiled. It was a terrifying sight. I believe you know my mate, Alpha Harrison, though you have a rather nasty habit of forgetting her true title. Alistair led Maeve down the center aisle. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, terrified of the combined power rolling off the couple. They reached the front of the room, stopping directly beneath the podium. Dr. Silas Montgomery stepped out from behind the royal guards, carrying a thick black briefcase. He walked to the center of the dance floor, snapping the locks open. By order of the royal crown, Silas's voice echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. An official audit has been conducted into the financial and territorial holdings of the Silver Pine Pack. Harrison visibly panicked. This is an outrage. You have no jurisdiction to audit a private pack without the council's— I am the council, Alistair snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Sit down, Harrison, before I force you down. Silas began pulling thick stacks of documents from the briefcase, passing them out to the high-ranking alphas sitting in the front rows. What you are looking at are the private banking records of Vanguard Trust, the shell corporation that holds the deed to the Silver Pine territory. For 10 years, Alpha Harrison has claimed sole ownership. However, forensic analysis proves that Harrison's signature on the transfer deeds is a master-class forgery. Whispers erupted across the ballroom as the alphas scrutinized the papers. The true owner of the Vanguard Trust, Silas continued, pointing directly at Maeve, is the sole surviving heir of the Aethelgard bloodline, Maeve Kensington. Furthermore, We have uncovered the mercenary contracts signed by Harrison ordering the assassination of Arthur Kensington to facilitate this theft. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Murdering a pack member was a severe crime. Murdering a high-ranking family to steal their wealth was an act of treason punishable by death. "Lies!" Adele shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. She lunged forward, her claws extending, aiming directly for Maeve. "She's a mute freak, a broken Omega. She manipulated the king." "Ma." Maeve didn't step back. She didn't look to Alistair for protection. Instead, she simply looked at Adele. Maeve's eyes flashed from hazel to a blinding incandescent gold. She didn't release a wild shockwave this time. She channeled her ancient aura with surgical precision. A targeted, unbearable pressure slammed directly onto Adele's shoulders. Adele gasped. Her forward momentum instantly halted as she was driven brutally to her knees, her face smashing into the polished marble floor. She lay there, entirely immobilized by the spiritual weight of a true sovereign, whimpering as her inner wolf submitted completely. The entire ballroom went dead silent again. They had just witnessed a supposed Omega force a pure-blooded Alpha's daughter into total submission without laying a single finger on her. The proof of her ancient bloodline was undeniable. Maeve stepped forward, standing over the trembling, disgraced girl who had tormented her for a decade. She looked up at Harrison, who was now being flanked by his own disgusted betas, ready to arrest him. The hum in Maeve's chest, the caged beast, was no longer trapped. It was free, and it was purring. She looked at the terrified Alpha, then to the silent, awestruck crowd. For the first time in 10 years, Maeve opened her mouth. Her vocal cords were stiff, her voice raspy and rough from disuse, but the command it carried vibrated through the very foundations of the hotel. "Get out of my house." The immediate aftermath of the Grand Obsidian Hotel summit did not unfold with the chaotic bloodshed typical of lycanthrope power struggles. Instead, it was a masterclass in calculated, suffocating ruin. When Maeve Kensington's raspy, long dormant voice echoed through the ballroom, commanding the usurper to get out of her house, the psychological backdraft was absolute. Alpha Harrison did not go down fighting. The oppressive, ancient gravity of Maeve's Ethelgard aura had completely severed his connection to his inner wolf. He collapsed against the crystal podium, weeping openly, a broken, pathetic shell of the tyrant who had ruled the Silver Pine territory for a decade. The elite betas and allied alphas who had spent the evening drinking his champagne and laughing at his jokes physically turned their backs on him. In their world, weakness was a sin, but theft of a royal bloodline was an unforgivable sacrilege. Within 60 seconds, the royal guard had Harrison in heavy, silver-lined shackles. The unmistakable click of the locking mechanisms echoed like a gavel striking wood in the silent room. Adele Harrison, still immobilized on the marble floor by the sheer spiritual pressure of Maeve's presence, could only let out a high-pitched, reedy keen of despair as her father was dragged out of the ballroom. But the true devastation of the Harrison family was not delivered by the sword. It was executed through a brutal, unforgiving labyrinth of corporate litigation and financial seizure. Alistair Sterling, understanding that a simple execution would be too merciful for the men who had stolen his mate's life, unleashed his most terrifying weapon, his legal team. The morning after the summit, a fleet of black SUVs arrived at the Silver Pine estate. They were not carrying warriors. They were carrying forensic accountants, private investigators, and a man named Thomas Arris. Thomas Arris was a legendary corporate litigator from Chicago, a wolf whose sharp mind and ruthless courtroom tactics had dismantled entire financial empires. Working alongside Dr. Silas Montgomery, Thomas initiated a total freeze on every single asset connected to the Harrison name. The twists of Harrison's betrayal ran far deeper than simply forging a deed. Sitting in the penthouse of the Sterling estate, Maeve reviewed the terrifying reality of her stolen life. Thomas Arris laid out the sprawling, sickening web of deceit across a massive glass conference table. "Harrison didn't just occupy your land, Queen Maeve," Thomas explained, adjusting his perfectly tailored cuffs. "He heavily mortgaged it. He used the Vanguard Trust Your Birthright as collateral to secure billions in international loans. He bought yachts, offshore properties, and funded political campaigns to keep the Lycan Council looking the other way. He thought he could outrun the debt because he believed the true heir was a mute, broken Omega who would die scrubbing his floors." "Where is the liquid capital?" Alistair demanded, standing behind Maeve's chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The scent of ozone and impending violence rolled off him in waves. "He attempted to move it," Thomas Arris replied with a predatory smirk. "Last night, the moment the guard arrested him, an automated failsafe was triggered. Harrison tried to wire $700 million to a ghost account in the Cayman Islands, but he made a mistake. He trusted a human private banker named Gregory Hayes to facilitate the transfer. Maeve looked up, her golden eyes sharp. She pulled a notepad toward her. She was still relying heavily on writing to communicate, conserving her severely strained vocal cords. "Did we stop it?" she wrote in elegant looping script. "Better than that," Thomas chuckled. "We paid Mr. Gregory Hayes a visit at 3 a.m. When confronted with the reality of facing the Alpha King's wrath, Mr. Hayes turned state's evidence immediately. "We didn't just intercept the 700 million. Gregory Hayes handed over the encryption keys to Harrison's entire shadow portfolio. We have everything. The Cayman accounts, the Swiss safety deposit boxes, the deeds to his private estates in Monaco. Alpha Harrison is not just disgraced. He is entirely, legally, and permanently destitute." The satisfaction that bloomed in Maeve's chest was profound. She didn't need to shed a single drop of blood to avenge her parents. She had used the very system Harrison had manipulated to trap him in a cage of his own making. A week later, the official Lycan tribunal was held deep within the subterranean chambers of the royal citadel. It was a cold, windowless amphitheater built of black stone, illuminated only by harsh, industrial lighting. Maeve sat at the high table beside Alistair, cloaked in heavy dark velvet, the sapphire Aethelgard jewel resting heavily against her collarbone. Harrison was brought out in chains. Without his wealth, his tailored suits, and his stolen alpha status, he looked small, haggard, and entirely mortal. He had been officially stripped of his wolf, a rare, agonizing ritual that permanently severed the spiritual connection, leaving him with a human lifespan and the crushing guilt of his crimes. He was sentenced to 80 years in solitary confinement in the human maximum security prison system, a fate orchestrated through Alistair's vast shadow influence in the mortal world. He would rot in a concrete box, surrounded by humans who would never know the monster he truly was. Then came Adele. She was led into the center of the amphitheater, trembling violently. She wore standard-issue gray canvas clothing, her blonde hair matted and unwashed. The arrogant, cruel girl who had poured boiling tea on Maeve just weeks prior was gone. When she looked up at the high table and met Maeve's calm, unwavering gaze, she immediately fell to her knees and wept. "Please," Adele begged, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Please, Maeve, I didn't know about your parents. I didn't know about the money. I was just following my father. Don't send me to the rogue lands. I'll die out there. I'll be your servant. I'll scrub the floors. Please." The irony of the plea hung heavy in the air. The elite wolves acting as the jury looked upon the girl with utter disgust. Alistair looked to Maeve, silently offering her the floor. The king's aura was deadly calm, entirely submitted to the judgment of his mate. Maeve stood. The amphitheater held its collective breath. She didn't channel her terrifying spiritual pressure this time. She didn't need to. She simply looked down at the girl who had made her life a living hell. Maeve took a deep, agonizing breath. Her throat burned, the atrophied muscles fighting against the command of her brain. But she refused to write this down. This needed to be heard. "You," Maeve forced the word out, her voice a rough, raspy whisper that carried perfectly in the dead silence. "You knew. I was bleeding. You." Laughed. Adele sobbed harder, pressing her forehead against the cold stone floor. "I am not a monster," Maeve continued, pausing to swallow the pain in her throat. She gripped the edge of the stone table. "I will not execute a fool. You are exiled, with nothing. If you cross my borders, you die." It was a brilliant, agonizing sentence. Adele was not granted the mercy of a quick death. She was stripped of her name, her pack, and her wealth, forced into the brutal wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. She would live the life of a frightened, starving outcast, the exact life she had forced upon Maeve for a decade. As the guards dragged the screaming girl away, Maeve sat back down, leaning heavily against Alistair as he wrapped an arm around her waist, kissing the top of her head. The vengeance was complete, but the reality of Maeve's recovery was just beginning. The stories told in the taverns claimed the ancient queen was healed by the moon goddess overnight, but the truth was far more grounded, built on grueling effort and quiet tears. 10 years of enforced silence had caused severe atrophy in her vocal cords and deep psychological blockages. Maeve didn't magically start delivering long, eloquent speeches. She fought for every syllable. Alistair, the ruthless tyrant who made the continent tremble, proved to have an ocean of patience when it came to his mate. He hired Dr. Beatrice Sullivan, the premier speech and trauma therapist in the country. For months, the penthouse of the Sterling estate became a quiet classroom. Beatrice, a warm but no-nonsense human woman who was fully aware of the lycanthrope world, sat with Maeve for hours every day. They practiced breathing exercises, phonetic repetition, and muscle relaxation. There were days of profound frustration, days when Maeve would throw her pen across the room, crying in silence because her throat simply wouldn't cooperate, the trauma of her past rising up to choke her. On those days, Alistair would dismiss the therapist. He would gather Maeve in his arms, sitting on the floor of the expansive bedroom, and simply hold her. He never pushed. He never demanded. He flooded their mate bond with absolute, unconditional devotion, letting her know that whether she spoke a million words or remained silent forever, she was his equal, his sovereign, and his heart. The breakthrough came on a quiet Tuesday morning in late autumn. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Alistair was standing by the glass, looking out over the gray skyline of Seattle, his shoulders tense as he reviewed a complex trade agreement on his tablet. Maeve was sitting on the sofa, a cup of warm, honeyed tea in her hands. She watched the stress line form between his stormy blue eyes. The hum in her chest, once a caged beast of anxiety, was now a steady, warm engine of pure affection. She set her teacup down. She took a deep breath, utilizing the diaphragm techniques Beatrice had taught her. She focused entirely on the broad expanse of his back. Alistair. It wasn't a raspy whisper. It was clear. It was soft, but it held the unmistakable resonance of her true voice. He froze. The tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. He turned around slowly, his stormy eyes wide with a vulnerability he only ever showed to her. Maeve stood up and closed the distance between them. She reached up, framing his strong jaw with her hands. "I love you," she said, the words falling perfectly from her lips, steady and true. Alistair let out a breath that sounded like a sob, wrapping his arms around her and lifting her off the floor, burying his face in her neck. It was the moment the broken Omega truly died, and the Queen fully stepped into her light. The rebuilding of the Vanguard Trust became Maeve's life's work. She did not return to the Silver Pine estate to live. The memories were too soaked into the floorboards. Instead, with the help of Thomas Arris and Dr. Silas Montgomery, she liquidated a massive portion of the corrupt Harrison portfolio. The funds were used to establish the Kensington Foundation. It became the most powerful philanthropic force in the lycanthrope world. Maeve built sprawling, state-of-the-art academies and sanctuaries across the continent specifically designed to protect, educate, and empower displaced Omegas and orphaned pups. She instituted sweeping legal reforms through the Lycan Council, fiercely backed by King Alistair, completely dismantling the outdated, abusive hierarchy that allowed packs to enslave their weakest members. The Silver Pine Manor itself was gutted to the studs. The dark, oppressive architecture was torn down, replaced with open glass, bright wood, and massive gardens. It was transformed from a prison of elite arrogance into the flagship campus of the Kensington Foundation. Where Maeve had once frozen on her knees scrubbing marble floors, young, rescued wolves now ran freely, laughing in the sunlight, completely safe under the absolute protection of the Alpha King and his fiercely devoted mate. Years later, the archives of the lycanthrope world were updated by Dr. Silas Montgomery. The history books no longer spoke of a defective, broken girl. They detailed the unprecedented legal and spiritual dismantling of a corrupt regime. They spoke of the sleeping queen, the woman who endured a decade of horrific silence, only to shatter the world's foundations with a single breath and rebuild it with an iron will. They learned the hardest, most enduring lesson of all, that true power does not always roar. Sometimes, it waits in the quiet dark, gathering its strength, enduring the unimaginable, until the exact moment it is ready to make the kings of the world bow. Are you ready to claim your own power? If Maeve's epic journey from a silenced Omega to a formidable queen kept you on the edge of your seat, then you belong right here with us. We drop high-stakes, dramatic stories full of shocking betrayals, secret identities, and ultimate revenge every single week.